This is the Catacombs of St Callixtus. It's spelt with an X often, so it looks like Callixtus, okay. And our guide explained that he was eventually became one of the popes, one of the bishops of Rome. I mentioned a writing the other evening when I was explaining sort of the transition from Caesars to popes and so on, and I mentioned a writing by a guy called Tertullian, who was writing at the same time as St Callixtus. And Tertullian describes Callixtus as the Pontifex Maximus, the Bishop of Bishops. Okay. Now, Pontifex Maximus at that time was still used as an identifying role of the pagan priesthood. Pontifex Maximus as a title hadn't passed to the popes officially yet. Okay. So he considered this guy in some way connected to these pagan practices that went on. The other person that our guide mentioned was a guy called Damasus. Now Damasus, I don't know whether you remember from Friday nights, whether people were still awake, Damasus was the first Pope or Bishop of Rome to have bestowed on him the name Pontifex Maximus. He was the guy who, when Gratian, Emperor Gratian, so a couple of generations after Constantine, as a Christian emperor, Gratian was the guy who refused the title, and Damasus, who was the Bishop of Rome at the time, was happy to receive it. Okay, so Damasus is the guy who in the 4th century came and basically opened up the tombs and made it legal to be here. These tombs, as you can see from the journey we've taken in, are outside the city walls. They were specifically outside the city walls because as this is a Christian burial site, it was not lawful to bury Christians alongside Romans and any other citizen because of the view that the Romans had towards Christians. It was not allowed. So they had to literally bury them outside the city walls, away from any of the holy sites of the Romans. We've said it was 20 kilometers of tunnels over 4 floors dug underground by hand, and it was volcanic rock that was easy to dig into, but as soon as it came exposed to the fresh air, the oxygen, it hardened up. And we've seen all the different things. There are a couple of things that weren't made clear this time round that were made clear previously. She did mention that later on, after these catacombs were finished, they were raided by barbarians. Do you pick up on that? She mentioned they were raided by barbarians. Anybody know why they were raided by barbarians? Wasn't because they were Christian at all. Pardon? Because of valuables. Because the burial practice was to bury the dead with treasures. Anybody know why they buried them with treasures? Because part of the Greco-Roman understanding of the route to Hades is that you have to cross over the river Styx. And in order to get over the river Styx, which is the barrier between the living and the afterlife, you have to pay the ferryman in order to get across there. Does this make sense? So even within the burial practices of the early Christians, you've got this syncretism, this mixture of ideas. I mentioned Hades very specifically. I've mentioned it previously, but Hades is mentioned explicitly 10 times in the New Testament as the place of the dead. Explicitly, the word Hades is used in the Greek. Now, the Hebrew equivalent, Sheol, the place of the dead, obviously what the New Testament writers in the Greek are trying to do is trying to translate ideas into a world that doesn't understand the Hebrew mentality, the Hebrew perspective. So Hades, absolutely, in the one sense, is a natural transition to make, which is why they've used the word. The problem is, in a culture that doesn't understand Hebrew, doesn't understand the Hebrew mindset, doesn't understand the distinction between the God of Israel and all this polytheistic pantheon of gods, they understand that the place they're going to, there's some blending of ideas still with all of their mythology, all of their ideas. So what we've got here is evidence that the early 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th century Christians have got this blended idea, this syncretism. And it's part of what we were looking at the different things within the Catholic Church and so on. Is this making sense to you guys? One of the things we didn't really see, they have some tombs down there which are actually sort of wooden or stone. They look like proper coffins, basically, sarcophaguses. And on the side of them, they sort of, for particularly rich people, they have a variety of different markings. Some are the classical Christian ones that we've been shown, the key and the roe and the ichthus and so on. But others have this river marking, again denoting this concept of the river Styx, of which they've got to go and cross. So there's this blending of ideas which just gets reinforced. You know, over generations, Christian theology has been formed. You know, the ideas of lots of different church fathers, lots of different teachers, lots of different understandings, influences from different cultures have come in. And as we build, each generation builds their understanding sort of founded on the understanding of the generations that's gone before them. It's obvious, it's what we do. How we think today is founded so much in Greek philosophical thought, all about reason and philosophy and all these different things, and the words we use are exactly the same. The same is true of Christian theology. Now, building on the understanding of the generations before is absolutely, there's nothing, you know, essentially wrong with that, providing what you're building on is the truth. But if what you're building on is lies, or a mixture of truth and lies, and you carry that on generation after generation over a couple of thousand years, you can find that what you have today is a long way from the truth it was intended to be. What we see in the Christians in the early centuries is this blended idea of beliefs. What we see in Christian artwork today has its influences dated right back to the Greek and Roman mythological ideas. When we think about angels and demons, you know, and people sitting on clouds and St. Peter and all the rest of it, there's no distinction in that artwork style that we see in Michelangelo's paintings and all the stuff in the Vatican and the Sistine Chapel between that and Greek mythological gods and goddesses. It's all rooted in the same place. It's just a straightforward transition from one to the next. But most people don't see these things. We've just come to accept it. I mentioned earlier about Mithras and this concept of the sun and the parallels between Mithras and obviously the account of Yeshua, Jesus' birth. Okay, and that Mithras had won this victory over the sun god. Now in Greek, in Roman, in Babylonian, in Egyptian mythologies and theologies, you've got this constant association between different gods and the sun and the moon and the stars and the constellations and the planets. It's a universal parallel with all of them. And what you've got then is you've got this blending, you've got all these things that come in to influence how people then understand this Christian faith, or this Jewish faith, maybe is a better way of putting it, because the Christian faith isn't, again, I reiterate, it was a Jewish faith at its core. And so when they're trying to understand and they're hearing the parallels in the story of Jesus' birth, and they're connecting it with the myths and everything that they already know, and what the devil's done is he's played a flanker. He's created a counterfeit. And he's created so many counterfeits that it's completely blurred the waters for those who don't have discernment and don't have understanding, don't have teaching, don't have training. They have no understanding of the Hebrew scriptures because there was no apostle to teach them in Rome. So what they do is they take what they know, add to it the other bits, and they figure that actually it's all one universal truth. It all comes together. Revelation 17 verse 9, I finished off with saying this. This calls for a mind having wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman is seated. And I mentioned that Rome is the city based on 7 hills or 7 mountains. Just for reference, and not probably because you're going to remember this, but the 7 mountains or hills of Rome, the Aventine, the Caelian, the Capitoline. We've seen the Capitoline. The Capitoline is where the Vittoriano is positioned. Esquiline, the Palatine, that was within the Roman Forum just next to the Arch of Titus. The Quirinal and the Viminal. Those are the 7 hills or mountains of Rome. 1 Peter 5 verse 13 also makes reference to Babylon. And in the translation that I've read, it says, in verse 13, it says, Messiah's community in Babylon, chosen together with you, sends you greetings. So does my son Mark. The implication is that Peter is in somewhere which he is identifying as Babylon in that moment when he's writing his first letter in that moment. Now, that may or may not have been Rome, but the suggestion is that Peter was here when he wrote that letter. And whether we believe all the tradition that surrounds it, there's a lot of things that point to the fact that Peter did actually eventually end up here. Choose to believe it or not. What I'm explaining to you doesn't hang on whether or not Peter was talking about Babylon, Rome in this moment. Revelation 18, this is a bit more sobering. It says this, and remember this is after chapter 17, obviously, and after chapter 17 explicitly states that the Babylon the Great that's being talked about is about this concept of a city built on 7 hills. Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great. She has become a den for demons, a haunt for every unclean spirit and for every unclean bird, and for every unclean and detestable beast. For all the nations have drunk of the wine of the fury of her immortality. The kings of the earth have committed sexual immorality with her, and the merchants of the earth grew rich off the power of her self-indulgence. Verse 4, Then I heard another voice from heaven saying, Come out of her, my people, lest you participate in her sins and receive her plagues. Now, we're looking back to the 1st century and we're looking at what Rome was back then. Okay, we're looking at the perception of Jews, the perception of Christians, the issue that people had with this monotheistic worldview versus the polytheistic worldview. But advance 2,000 years to where we are today, and there's still a massive muddying of the waters. Massive muddying of the waters. And the problem is that this whole concept of blending has caused even, in one sense, the most devout of believers can't see the distinction between the lines anymore. They've come to open up the Bible and they cannot see the gaping void between what the Bible explicitly explains the church, the biblical faith should look like. They can't see the gaping void between that and what the Christian world, in the most part, looks like. And remember what I said earlier, the Catholic Church, whilst we see a great distinction between us and the Catholic Church, for the most part, the 30,000+ Protestant denominations that now exist, the many other factions of the Catholic Church, the Eastern Orthodox, and all the others around the world, all chart their single point origin back predominantly to the Roman Catholic origin. Now, if the Roman Catholic Church, or the Roman Church, was founded on a syncretized theology, which we're seeing, and you advance that 2,000 years, it's reasonable to understand that actually some of that's been carried forward. In spite of the degrees of resistance that have been made over certain issues, there's still some stuff that's been carried down the line. Let me just show you a couple of other things quickly before we wrap up. Jeremiah 44. Verse 17, Instead, we will definitely do every word as went out of our mouth. This is Jeremiah speaking the words that Israel is speaking back to God. So Israel is speaking back to God in this moment by the letter of Jeremiah. Burning incense to the Queen of Heaven and pouring out drink offerings to her, just as we did, we and our fathers, our kings and our princes in the cities of Judah and in the streets of Jerusalem. For then we had plenty of food, were well off and saw no calamity. So they're associating those things with the fact that they were worshipping the Queen of Heaven in this moment. But since we stopped burning incense to the Queen of Heaven and pouring out drink offerings to her, we have lacked everything and have been consumed by the sword and by famine. Moreover, when we were burning incense to the Queen of Heaven and pouring out drink offerings to her, when we made cakes for her in her image and poured out drink offerings to her, were we without our husbands? I.e., they were doing it all together. Verse 22, Then Adonai could no longer endure it because of the evil of your deeds, because of the abominations that you committed. So your land has become a wasteland, a desolation and a curse without inhabitant, as it is this day. The Lord's response to what they were doing of worship of the Queen of Heaven was to make the land a wasteland. It was part of their idolatry. We know Jeremiah was living in the day when Babylon eventually conquered Jerusalem. Verse 25 goes on to say, "Thus says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, saying, you and your wives," you can't just blame it on your wives, guys, it's you, your husbands as well. "You and your wives have both spoken with your mouths and fulfilled it with your hands, saying, we will definitely perform our vows that we have vowed to burn incense to the Queen of Heaven and to pour out drink offerings to her. You surely will confirm your vows and surely will perform your vows." Okay? I'm emphasizing this because it's talking about worship of the Queen of Heaven. Now, does anybody know how people refer to Mary? As the Queen of Heaven. Now, she's not the only one that bears the title Queen of Heaven. There are many other goddesses, Aphrodite, Venus. But there's a little bit more to it. Let me join another dot for you. Ezekiel chapter 8. "He said further to me," so this is a complete separation. This is Ezekiel, a vision, whilst he's in Babylon. "He said further to me, you will see greater abominations that they are doing. He brought me to the door of the gate of the Lord's house, which was toward the north. Behold, the women sat there weeping for Tammuz. He said to me, have you seen this, son of man? You will again see even greater abominations than these. So he brought me to the inner court of the Lord's house. Behold, at the door of the temple of the Lord, between the porch and the altar, were about 25 men, with their backs towards the temple of the Lord and their faces towards the east. And they were bowing in worship eastward towards the sun." Did anybody see what was right bang smack in the centre at the end of St. Peter's Basilica? It wasn't Jesus. It wasn't a cross. In fact, did you see Jesus anywhere? He was there. He was. But he wasn't front and centre. The Mithras link is not a small link. Where do you think the concept of the halo was birthed? Why do you think that behind Jesus as the Son of God, you've always got this association with the sun? Now, some would consider it innocent, or this is just, this is just speculation or whatever. It's more than that, folks. It's born out of this concept of the sun worship. Tammuz, the guy that's referenced in Ezekiel 8, is the son of Semiramis. Semiramis was the queen of heaven according to the Babylonian mythology. Okay, she was the mother of the gods. And there are parallels between the Babylonian, the Greek, and the Roman. Semiramis in Babylonian is associated with Rhea, or Aphrodite, or Venus. Okay? Tammuz, the sun, in Greek is associated with Dionysius, and in Roman with Bacchus, who was the guy. Okay? Sun gods in Greek, Helios; in Roman, Sol Invictus; Shamash in Babylon; and Ra in Egyptian. It all transfers. I hope. No. There's just one other thing I want to show you. I've got a quote here. Well, I've got a few quotes from some of the church fathers. Justin Martyr, chapters 69 and 70 of his discussion with Trypho the Jew, where he draws a link with Bacchus, the son of Jupiter. And the concept, what I'm saying is that you've got Jupiter, the father of the gods, and you've got Bacchus, his son. In chapter 70, he talks about Mithras, the sun god. But I've got here an account from Eusebius, the Bishop of Caesarea, that talks about Constantine's vision and his conversion to Christianity. Okay? So let me just read this to you to finish. So this was written by Eusebius, who lived from 260 to 339 AD. It says this: before Constantine went into battle, he considered what power to honour and rely on for protection. He contemplated whether to choose multiple deities or to fight in the name of the single God Almighty. This is Eusebius's perspective, remember. So when he talks about the single God Almighty, that's his perspective, but clearly not Constantine's. In this account, the leader chose to pursue God and prayed for his assistance. At broad daylight, he claimed to witness a magnificent and radiant figure of a cross above the sun. Above the sign was the inscription, "In hoc signo vinces." By this sign, conquer. The next morning he had his army paint their shields and carry this sign that he had seen early into battle. He was confident that Christ would deliver him. In 312, Constantine met his opponent in battle at Red Rocks, 9 miles north of Rome, surrounded by large hills and the river Tiber. Constantine's forces met Maxentius, who was then ruler of Rome. This was a bit of a civil war that went on. And his army fleeing to the single Milvian bridge across the river Tiber, where Maxentius drowned. Do you remember what I said to you right back early on? When two nations fought, when two armies fought, it wasn't that they considered the God of the nation that won the true God and the others no God at all. It was the fact that they just considered their God more powerful. Does that make sense? That's quite key to understand. So if I fought against, if me and Matt went toe-to-toe right now, and I gave honour to one good God and he gave honour to a different one, and I won, it wouldn't be that I considered Matt's God not to be real, I'd just consider my God stronger. This is essentially what we see with Constantine. It's the exact same thing, which is why Constantine then on his arch, 315 AD, 3 years after this, after he's been converted, is still giving honour to the different gods. It's why in the artwork that is still handed down through the church, generations after Constantine, Gratian, and then it gets handed on to Damasus, the first pope, and this Pontifex Maximus title gets handed on down the generations. It's why there's no conflict between the Bible, in their eyes, and accepting all of this pantheon of gods. It's why it's not a problem having an Egyptian obelisk in the middle of St. Peter's Square. Is this making sense to you? The question for me with a lot of this is, okay, we can identify some of this stuff absolutely clearly. What's harder to identify sometimes is the thinking, the understanding, the perceptions, the interpretation of the scriptures that we've accepted as part of it as well. Which is why I've gone to great lengths over the last couple of days to point out to you some of the context of Paul's world changes how we understand some of the scriptures that he contains within his letters.